And we'll be hearing
more or
about
less.
that. But I want to talk about that today because tomorrow is the birthday of the guy that founded UT. His name was Samuel Carrick, and he was born 260 years ago tomorrow. And like a lot of things about his life, they're some of it's mysterious. We're not absolutely sure, but most sources say he was born in Pennsylvania. Bob may or may not have another idea about that. But one interesting thing about him that you can see at his grave downtown in the First Presbyterian Church graveyard is that he had an unusual middle name. Most people of his era had just two names: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Samuel Carrick is usually just called Samuel Carrick, but some documents plus his gravestone has an odd abbreviation in the middle, and it's CZR period. And by some accounts, his middle name was Tsar, like the Russian ruler. And some put an E on the end of that, but we don't know what the origin of that was. But anyway, he wherever he spent his earliest years. He went to Western Virginia, kind of a center of learning that people don't know as much about as they should. In what was known as Rockbridge County, Virginia, a place called originally called Augusta Academy, became known during the American Revolution as Liberty Hall, and it was a center of learning and liberal education, which meant something in those days. It was founded by Presbyterians, but they had this idea that education should be liberal. It should bring in everything. People should study all aspects of the classics, sciences, everything, if they get a good education. And this was located in Rockbridge County, which, by the way, is not named for someone named Rockbridge, but because there's a rock bridge, a rather famous place called we know as the Natural Bridge in Virginia. And if you've ever driven up I-81, you take the exit, you can actually see it still there. It was an amazing landmark 250 years ago, and still is today. It was kind of halfway between here and Washington, so a lot of people stopped there from Knoxville to Washington. But it's amazing how many people got their education in Rockbridge County, Virginia, at Liberty Hall, which is 325 miles away from here, and then ended up in Knoxville somehow or another. A lot of these people knew each other there and came here and met each other again in Knoxville, so far away, but it was so connected to so many different people who came here. But one of them was a guy named Archibald Roane, who was the second governor of Tennessee, and one's a guy whose name you might have heard, which was Sam Houston. He was from Rockbridge County. And also Isaac Anderson, who founded Maryville College, and I want to get into him a bit later, but one of them was a guy named Samuel Carrick, who got his education there. By one account, he was one of the first, maybe the first person to actually get a bachelor's degree from Liberty Hall in the 1780s, I guess. But he came down here and came here as a Presbyterian minister first, and began teaching out at Forks of the River, and came into town and founded Blount College. Later known as East Tennessee College, I think, during his rather short lifetime. But it's amazing how much this guy accomplished here. He brought the first church to Knox County. Knox County did not have a church. Blount County did, but Knox County didn't until Samuel Carrick established first the Lebanon and the Forks Church, and then First Presbyterian Church. And then then was involved in the State Constitutional Convention in 1796. He was the official chaplain there. But in between, he founded a college, which was just a very small organization in 1794. People don't realize who live here, but that's really, really, really old for a college of any sort, and especially a state university. Has one of the oldest founding dates of a state university in America. It's even older than UVA. If you credit that date has some footnotes that Bob may get into, but
yeah, way older than UVA actually.
Yeah. In fact, we were already they were talking about moving it to, or they moved it to the Hill not too long after UVA started. But anyway, I want to just open this, and then I'll pass over to Bob by reading this little piece. We don't know a lot about Samuel Carrick. He was talked about when he was alive, and then after he died, I don't see him mentioned much at all in newspapers. But then there was a new interest in him in the 1870s when J.G.M. Ramsey, who was one of the, I guess, the first statewide historians in Tennessee, who grew up in the Forster River area and knew Samuel Carrick as a kid, as a little kid. He knew Samuel Carrick and remembered him, this guy who died back in 1809, remembered him in the 1870s and described him. He said, this is J.G.M. Ramsey talking about Carrick, who he called it the strange minister. He was such I think he was an unusual guy who got people's attention when he walked into a room. He had a gravity to him. He said, although a young man, he was very grave and dignified, very solemn in the pulpit and out of it. I can recall him well yet, and this is 60 years after Carrick died. He was about 5'8", ruddy and inclined to corpulency, or rather plethoric. That's a very polite way to say someone is overweight, but plethoric. His whole person was cast in the most symmetrical mold, and would anywhere be called handsome. But he was not less attentive to his sacred task. He had a very warm, affectionate heart, full of pity and sympathy for the helpless. The sublime conception of the Christian system was not only overwhelmed him, but seemed to maintain the man. His embassy was peace and reconciliation, and the terrors of the law hung like a pall upon his kind heart. That's a really interesting thing to say about somebody. I'm not even completely sure what it means, but Bob Hutton, I would love to hear anything, any of your insights about Reverend Carrick and what motivated him, what brought him here to.
Well, I think in one way to think about Samuel Carrick and the middle name situation, it baffles me too, and I will try not to put too much attention onto it. One thing to consider about him is how typical he is. Here we're talking about one of these, we're often hearing about the Scots-Irish, right? This area likes to celebrate its Scots-Irish heritage, and that's basically who Carrick is. He's part of a group of, he's part of a migration that's coming to Virginia, Western Virginia, what's now East Tennessee, and eventually they're going to spread out to places like what's now Alabama and Mississippi, Western Tennessee. They're coming down what's called the Great Valley. And you were mentioning the Rockbridge County area around Natural Bridge and Luray and all these places where these future Sam Houston and Bigfoot Wallace and all these famous future Texans are going to be from. It's all part of this sort of gradual migration that's taking place before, during, and after the American Revolution. So one way to think about Samuel Carrick is as part of just what's going on in the mid 1700s in terms of migration in the United States, and also the fact that he was Presbyterian minister with a certain amount of training. That's also somewhat typical of the time period. It's not going to be too long before Knoxville is going to be more Methodist, more Baptist, and in fact, who shows up in the 1850s? A handful of Catholics, right? But for the time being, though, in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, it's going to be people like him and Anderson. Was it Archibald Anderson?
Isaac Anderson.
Isaac Anderson, yeah. There's a handful of Presbyterian Andersons. These very enterprising Presbyterians who have a somewhat semi-Calvinist outlook on life, but they're always inclined toward moving west. And the Great Valley, which you mentioned, I-40 and I-81, they basically, you can drive it and you can see the Great Valley going right up back to where they came from in Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it all traces back to Princeton, what's now Princeton University.
Yeah. I'm fascinated in the what values they brought with them, educational values. I've read about Liberty Hall, and it was unusual in that it was a little bit of an apostate or something. It was kind of straining at the confines of being a Presbyterian organization. organization. They kept saying, we want a liberal organization. We don't want to be just a seminary for ministers. We want to have a fully liberal organization. And when they taught religion, it wasn't just Presbyterian religion there too. It was unusual. And that Samuel Carrick, I think, brought that when he founded Blount College. He specified that this is a non-sectarian college, which was an unusual. Never mind that he was a Presbyterian minister. Mm-hmm. It was unusual for any college to be non-sectarian in 1794.
It was practically unheard of, and also to be Presbyterian meant. I mean, what's also going on in the 1780s? This is the latter days of or maybe even the central days of the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
And educated people, whether they're Anglican or Presbyterian or what have you, they have this sort of love-hate relationship with the Enlightenment. And for most of your more educated Presbyterians by the end of the 18th century, they've come to, understand that it's very important to have a certain amount of secular knowledge to enhance your understanding of the Almighty, to go along with it. So what does when Carrick starts assigning reading at this little parlor group, parlor meeting that we called Blount College, or that he eventually called Blount College, yeah, they probably read from the King James Bible, but because that's what was available. But apparently they also read their Euclid, because everybody in the 1700s and 1800s had to know Euclid. I have no idea why. It's just shapes to me, but that's what people did. And Horace and other, whatever ancient writings were available. Horace, in all the accounts of early Blount College, Horace comes up way more often than, say, Virgil or Juvenal or any of those Roman writers. So there's a lot of emphasis on classical reading, and it's a very interesting moment in American history that Americans don't often think about, the relationship between the sacred and the profane is adding up to one big kind of education.
Yeah, and I think they thought that this is one of the first times that people have governed themselves, and to govern themselves in a democratic republic, and to govern themselves, they need to be educated, as well educated as any leaders should be. And
Presbyterians put a gigantic emphasis on literacy.
Yeah.
As did Methodists and Baptists. But those two denominations, they're still in their infancy at this point. Presbyterianism is kind of going through its golden age stage at this point. So there's a tremendous emphasis on the importance of literacy and how that would contribute to, the self-determined understanding of Scripture.
And there was some moral teaching and character building teaching at this era too. And I'm fascinated with the example of his younger colleague, who also came out of Liberty Hall, who came here, and they say that Carrick and Isaac Anderson had a mentor type relationship, a big brother, little brother sort of relationship. And Isaac Anderson, interestingly, after Carrick died, Isaac Anderson led a schism away from the First Presbyterian Church, which Carrick had founded, with a new doctrine called Hopkinsianism, which was an interesting moral view of the world, where he believed it was, or the Hopkinsians believed it was sinful to anticipate an afterlife, because that was selfish, that you should obey God because that's what you should do.
Well, there's another Presbyterian schism going on almost exactly at that same time too. The Cumberland Presbyterians.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. I thought it was later, but it might be. Yeah, that might be.
It's the first decade of the 1800s. A lot of these guys, they got so far west, they said, well, we have a very hard time rounding up ministers who actually have seminarian training.
Yeah.
We want to be able to have ministers who are basically self-taught.
Yeah. Well, that's true. One thing though that made Isaac Anderson especially interesting. Isaac Anderson, again, who went to the same academy in Liberty Hall in Rutledge County, came here, studied with Carrick, preached in some of the same churches, went to Maryville and founded Maryville College in 1819. And Maryville College was unusual for 1819 in the South, because he did not discriminate on the basis of race. This is extraordinary to think about. he had blacks and whites and
And Native Americans.
later Asians, and yeah, in
Go Scots.
yeah, it was amazing, and we know a lot about him. You know, he outlived Carrick by 50 years.
Yeah.
But we don't know whether some of these same values, whether he got some of these values from Carrick, whether Carrick had any sense of civil rights or any interest in other races. It's probably something they talked about, but
well, I'm not. It's really hard, like you say. It's really hard to say if Carrick, his understanding of enlightenment and Christianity extended that way toward other races, but it did seem to be in favor of crossing the line between the sexes, though, didn't it?
I guess so. He had a few female students there. Yeah. Tell about them.
Well, we know of Barbara Blunt and I believe 4 other women who I don't have written down in front of me, but you know, familiar surnames of East Tennessee.
Yeah.
One of them might have been a Ramsey. The Ramseys are always very involved in what becomes UT. Anyway, you know, a number of women that were recorded as having studied at Blunt College, starting, I think, no earlier than, say, 1797, I believe, maybe even later than that. You know, once it had sort of gotten established. And that's interesting to me for a handful of reasons. These are mostly well-to-do young women. They're almost all well-to-do, you know, landed young women, especially Barbara Blunt. It shouldn't surprise us too much that they're seeking some sort of education to become part of, you know, Republican motherhood and ideals like that. But at the same time, bear in mind that there are very few, if any, you know, forms of access for formal education for women at this stage. What's the school in Oberlin?
Yeah.
Oberlin won't be opening until the I believe the 1830s.
I think you're right. Yeah. A few decades later. Yeah. People have claimed that UT was the first coeducational college, and I've heard people kind of question that because there were just 5, and some of them were very, very young, and some of them later went to, after going to this college, later went to prep school. So it was not necessarily a full college education they were getting. But
well, really, I mean, that's a very important point. The very fact that they start calling this Blunt College after the Blunt family.
Yeah.
I mean, that by itself is one of the only sorts of formalization you really have until 1807.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically Carrick meeting in the old parsonage. That's what it is. Yeah. Studying with the old minister in the parsonage, and it was probably by our standards. It probably seemed very formal by our standards, but by the standards of the 18th century, it might have seemed very ad hoc.
Yeah. And that was located on Gay Street, precisely where the Tennessee Theater is today. And it's interesting that that's right across the street from Carrick's grave. I mean, Carrick could, you can read Carrick's grave from the back of this property here, back of the Tennessee Theater. And it was just a 2-story frame house there, wasn't it? But there's I've just recently I've realized that there was a second campus before, or at least I don't know to what extent it was actually developed, but before UT's Hill, that they were on a place called Poplar Springs. Have you run across that at all?
A very brief reference.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure where Poplar Springs is.
I think it was over near where Caswell Park is now.
Is that right?
So, and this was about the time that Carrick died, that they were talking about moving there. And did they reopen there or in the place on Gay Street? I don't know for sure. But yeah, there's a lot we don't know. Maybe a lot we can't know unless we find new sources we don't know about. Do you have a notion of how many people attended school at Blunt College?
Between 1794 and what was it, the year he died? 1809?
1809, that's right.
Yeah, I think it was a matter of a couple dozen, and I think there was only 1 or 2 actual degrees conferred. In fact, I think there was just 1 degree conferred.
But one of them was it Clement Clay? Was that because he later became governor and senator from Alabama, U.S. senator?
Yeah.
a pretty high success rate for such a small group of people.
Yeah, it's a pretty august body as far as the old South exploration of the old Southwest and stuff like that. Future senators, future land barons, and of course the Blunt family. It's William Blunt, is impeached by the U.S. Senate and then dies relatively suddenly.
Yeah.
Not too long after Carrick, I believe.
Actually, before. Yeah.
Well, before Carrick, yeah.
Yeah. Now here's a probably speculative sketch of Samuel Carrick. It's surprising how many people we don't have pictures, like James White. We don't know exactly what he looked like, but this is a latter-day sketch that is on the wall at First Presbyterian Church, because they revere him as their first minister, whereas UT is he's their founder and first president. But that's perhaps based on the description by J.G.M. Ramsey. And the next one is interesting, and this is a kind of a surprising picture by Lloyd Branson, well-known artist, our first, I guess, professional artist in Knoxville. Late in his life, did this piece called "Sheep Shearing Incident," and I'd love to know more about what the incident was, but this is Reverend Carrick, supposedly in the middle. It looks like he's doing a lot of the work, or holding the sheep down at least, while the woman's shearing him. And the fellow over on the left is Hugh Lawson White. Hugh Lawson White was his student, and I think that Hugh Lawson White got most of his formal education from Samuel Carrick, sometimes in just a one-on-one tutorial situation. But Hugh Lawson White later became a U.S. senator. Later was president of the Senate, president pro tem of the Senate in 1833 or so, and ran for president himself, president of the United States in 1836, and was one of the, I think, the first kind of the anti-Jackson faction that became known as the Whigs. But a very interesting and important guy whose name we should know. But he's buried in the same graveyard as Carrick and William Blunt are. But
Jack, was the sheep shearing incident related to when the Chickamauga Cherokee attacked at the end of the 1780s, and allegedly Reverend Carrick distinguished himself by taking up arms and helping to defend?
That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. I don't know. Hugh Lawson White was the story was that during the days when John Sevier was raising hell with the Cherokee villages to the south, all the men who were soldiers in town were away from Knoxville and with following John Sevier around. And I think it was almost like the blood feuds you talk about in Kentucky, because I think that the Indians would do something the white people didn't like, and then the white people would push back and come down like a harder still and double down. Everybody was doubling down and getting back at each other and feuding. But there are only 38 white men left in Knoxville. This is 1793, and John Sevier and his army was away. And I wouldn't be surprised if Hugh Lawson White was away with the army, because he was a soldier in those days. But Samuel Carrick was not a soldier, and he was here in town. Among these 38 guys, a lot of them were too old to be soldiers, but they did this. The Chickamaugas had a mass of warriors on the west side of town, 2,000 of them, I think, by one account, and they destroyed a station, Cabot Station, near where West Hills is today, and killed everybody in the station, men, women, children, and were about to advance on Knoxville, the white man's capital. Knoxville was the capital of the Southwestern Territory at this time, and could have easily destroyed it, because there were about 200 Chickamaugas to every Knoxvillian in the city, even counting women and children. So it would have been no contest. They could have just wiped Knoxville completely off the map, burned it down. But there was this brilliant ruse. They left the two oldest men of these 38 and left them downtown to shoot off some cannons. So they would hear, the Indians would hear the sound of the report of explosions in the city, and but then they did this feint, I guess you would call it, this ruse where they appeared over probably in the Pleasant Ridge area, including Samuel Carrick. And I don't know whether he was actually armed or not. These were just 38 guys who went out and made a show of being an army with a bunch of pennants and stuff. And they acted like, they had a mass of forces. They were spaced out along the top of this ridge. And the Chickamaugans could see them on top of the ridge over to the north, and they could hear these cannons going off over to the east. And they thought they were in trouble because they thought there were maybe two armies that they were going to have to deal with. So they argued a lot, and then completely withdrew. And that was the closest Knoxville ever came. And I think even counting the Soviet years, the Soviet Cold War years, of being completely obliterated off the map.
And then Dragon Canoe died relatively soon after that.
Yeah, the same year, I believe. One of the leaders of the Unions, but it was Doublehead and John Watts and I forgot the other one who were there and destroyed Cabot Station. But they called them, including Samuel Carrick, they called him the Invincible 38. And a poignant story about Samuel Carrick: while he was away, while he was away doing this ruse fainting routine, his wife back in Forks of the River or area, his wife died. And there's this Gothic scene that people have described of only women were there to bury her, and they poled her across the Holston River to the Lebanon the Forks graveyard there. And her grave today is the oldest marked grave in Knox County. Elizabeth Carrick is buried there by herself, and Samuel Carrick was buried in downtown Knoxville. But anyway, that's a quick version of his. I think Samuel Carrick's probably his only military adventure was this kind of non-military ruse in a way against the Chickamaugans. Who were I sometimes compared them to Al Qaeda. They were kind of the radical, the radical faction of the Cherokee and Creeks who were didn't want whites on this side of the mountains.
Well, they're the ones that disagreed with the Treaty of the Long Islands.
Yeah. But anyway, that's that. So he had an very interesting life for a guy who died at age 49. At age 49, and I think just about a month after he turned 49, and supposedly died after staying up all night to write a sermon for his.
According to Ramsey.
For his little church club, and he never actually saw a church built in Knoxville. It's interesting that they never prioritized it. His church met in the barracks or under trees or something. They were just kind of a club of people who worshiped together, and that was the only church and the closest thing there was to a church in Knoxville for 25 years. So but anyway, but Carrick died in 1809, and it was not just the death of the founder, president, and only professor of the college. Was there ever another professor than Carrick
during the time that it was Blount College, and for the very small amount of time that it became East Tennessee College? He was the sole professor proprietor. But there was a board of trustees. Now that's the important thing to remember. A board of trustees was gathered probably mainly among his parishioners, and after he dies, they continue meeting over the course of the next, I think it's a good 13 years almost until you actually see East Tennessee College functioning as a school ever again. But there's two things going on during the teens in Knoxville. You have East Tennessee College taking a powder, and coincidentally or not, it's also when Knoxville falls behind two other cities in this thing we're starting to call Tennessee. That being Nashville and Memphis. And I think it's a weird. I don't think it's a coincidence at all, but it's a good way of sort of illustrating the history of Knoxville. How this school exists only on paper and only according to a yearly or twice yearly meetings held by the Board of Trustees during the time period when Steam power makes Nashville and Memphis important places. King Cotton makes Western Tennessee start to overtake East Tennessee. And before you know it, East Tennessee is starting to play have the backseat role in the state of Tennessee. Not to mention the fact that the capital moves.
Yeah,
The
I was
capital
about to
moves
say.
west and never comes back.
Yeah. It moved to the middle of the state where it probably logically should be, but in 1819 or so.
Yeah.
And Knoxville looked like it was dying on the vine. We lost our college, we lost our capital. What reason was there to have a city here at all? They might as well have wiped it out in 1793. There was no other reason for it to be here. But somehow these trustees got together in 1820, right after Knoxville lost capital status, and said, let's start this up again somehow. And Carrick died broke. They didn't have any money too. That was back in 1809. So they raised money somehow and got the thing going.
Well, meanwhile, there had been a little bit of assistance from Congress, though, right? The college, East Tennessee College, was going to benefit from the sale of land south of the river. Yeah. And these, of course, were, technically Cherokee lands, depending on how far south the river you're going by 1815. But what most people are talking about by the 1820s, when the land is still being used as the funding for the school, it's not the Cherokee, it's farmers, it's white farmers who are essentially squatters on this land. Mm-hmm. And in the press at the time, they come to be known as the South of the River folk. Mm-hmm. And by the time you get around to the end of the 1820s, there's a real sense of resentment among the South of the River folk toward this institution of higher learning that's basically, using their alleged wealth and land to fund itself and turning farmers into squatters. These guys didn't consider themselves squatters. They considered themselves frontiersmen and farmers. So that creates a lot of court battles. And it also creates the opportunity for Jacksonian era politicians to attack East Tennessee College as a seat of aristocracy and privilege.
Yeah, that wonderful description of up on his melancholy hill. That was that from 1830 or so. That
it's a little bit earlier than that, but the one from Gunn.
Yeah.
And he talks about the sons of aristocrats stargazing from the what do you call it? The portico on top of the building.
Yeah. It's that's a fascinating description, and and to think of it's the same hill we see today. But let's talk about the hill a little bit. And whether they were downtown or over east of there, they in 1826 they found this piece of land that was for sale, and it apparently had not been developed at all over the years, and it was wooded. They bought it. It looked like a great, symbolic place to put a college up on top of, I think, the steepest hill in the downtown area. Certainly, I once figured out the heights, compared all the heights of the hills. That's one of the tallest hills, this side of Sharps Ridge, anyway.
Yeah.
In town, but they bought that hill and began digging up there. And they ran into some bones, and they gosh, these must be, at first they think they must be Indian bones, and must be an old Indian burial place, but they realized that they'd only been there for about 30 years. They were early settlers' bones. And
well, some of the Blunt family.
It was
allegedly.
But people came and went so much in those days that they completely forgot that there was a graveyard up there. And
but the hill was associated also with the Blunt family. For years, it was called Barbara Hill after Barbara Blunt. And I've always tried to figure out when in the history of UT that people started to forget about it being called Barbara Hill and just simply be called the Hill. Because, as late as the 1890s, when UT did become co-ed permanently, the young women who started their first literary society as students, they named it in honor of Barbara Blunt, and operating on top of Blunt Hill. And so sometime in the course of the 20th century, people sort of forgot about that.
I often see it referred to as College Hill in the Civil War and later period, but and there was a Civil War fort on the hill too during. But we have a picture, by the way, Paul, of of Old College, which was built, I think it was finished in 1828. And can we bring that up? This was the very first building ever built on the current campus of UT. And
And if you can see the very top of it, it does have kind of a widow's watch where they actually did set up an astronomy experiment. I'm not sure if they had a true telescope, but they did practice stargazing for the sons of the aristocrats.
I believe even Carrick taught astronomy somehow in Blunt College.
Yeah, it was considered a skill. I mean, think about it. A lot of these young men were going to be going into surveying. Yeah, and people like Daniel Boone and George Washington, they're all known as great surveyors. And if you're going to be a surveyor, you need to. I think either Mason and Dixon, one of those two, was an astronomer. So knowing some astronomy is a very important skill. It makes sense, especially for the landed gentry.
Of course, and people still go up there to watch astronomical phenomena today. But this old college, I guess it wasn't called Old College when they first built it. I guess it was just East Tennessee College when they built it. It was stood by itself for a long time. But by the end of the Civil War, I think they were calling it Old College, and it was still there until the 19 teens. And there wasn't a lot of preservation interest in Knoxville. But when people heard that Old College was going to be torn down, people got a lot of alumni got very sentimental about the building and wanted to try to save it somehow, even if you had to move it somewhere. And for a while, there was an attempt to move it to another place on the hill so they could build the great big landmark building that would become known as Aries Hall. But finally, I think they raised 15,000, but needed 20,000 to do it, or something like that, and it just didn't quite work, and just ended up just tearing it down. But anyway, it was there for almost a century. And
you had it, and you also had East and West College, and they were Old College. At least I think all three buildings were constructed by originally from Virginia family of carpenters and contractors named the Crutchfields.
Yeah.
And the information I have suggests that the Crutchfields actually used enslaved labor to build these buildings.
Yeah, that's been an issue at a lot of older colleges to acknowledge that. And of course, today we don't have any buildings that date to the era of slavery. And
that's right.
The oldest college, the oldest building on campus is right to I think to the left of this, right? The South College, which dates to 1871, I believe. So. Anyway, let's show another one, Paul. All right, here's a Joseph Estabrook we saw briefly there. Tell us about him, Bob. He was an interesting. He wasn't from here, but he was an interesting guy, though.
He really is a big factor in turning East Tennessee College into, well, quite literally turning it into a university. It's under his watch the ETC becomes ETU. And he was originally from, I believe, New Hampshire. He had studied at Princeton. There's that constant connection to Princeton always going on. He had briefly studied for the Presbyterian Seminary, so he had some association with Presbyterianism. But he was a professional educator, and he was a great believer in democratizing education as much as possible. And one of the means, we look at the class catalogs that you start seeing printed during his presidency. And there's a greater emphasis on what was starting in the Jacksonian period. They were starting to consider more practical aspects of education. One of those was teaching English, because the general idea was that soon Tennessee would start having primary schools, common schools as they would call them then. And we need to train people to teach in these little schools. So why are we bothering with Greek and things like that you may never use in your career, when you should be, understanding basic English grammar so you can teach it to students back in Greene County. So Estabrook sort of, he has a famous speech about the importance of democratic education. I'm not sure if he actually used the word democratic, but that was the general idea. Mm-hmm. And really had a gigantic change, a tremendous change in the university. I would say that I mean, Carrick, of course, is a founder, but in terms of transforming a relatively loose organization that we would call a school and turning it into something pretty permanent, you got to give Joseph Estabrook a tremendous amount of credit for that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Interesting fellow. Yeah. He was one of several New Englanders who moved here around the same time, including Perez Dickinson, who was Emily Dickinson's cousin, and
Oh, really?
several others were
Mm.
kind of, it's almost like they made a caravan and all came down at once. And a lot of them were educators when they first got here. And I think Perez Dickinson was too, but he became a merchant, made a whole lot more money than educators ever made. But yeah, but he's the guy that founded his island home, which is island home is named for. Lots of stories about all those New Englanders, probably 20 or so of them in all.
But Estabrook, he ends up leaving in kind of an embarrassing situation when, not too long after people like Dr. Gunn were going after them for being aristocratic. What's the next plan of attack in the 1840s? There were too many complaints around town that the school was too eat up with Presbyterians. And so when Estabrook leaves, and I believe in 1850, he leaves under kind of a cloud of embarrassment where he had just been driven out by being harassed in the newspapers by people like Parson Brownlow. It's around the time Brownlow shows up in town. And Brownlow was always after, he was such a caustic figure when it came to denominational differences.
Yeah.
Long before we know him as Tennessee's, Reconstruction era governor or anything like that.
Yeah.
He was this fire-eating Methodist.
Yeah.
And he hated Presbyterians because he considered them, kind of Latter-day Calvinists.
Yeah.
And he couldn't stand the idea that this allegedly public university was unofficially still sectarian in a sense. So Brownlow, sometimes we look at Brownlow and we think of the fighting parson and the cussing parson as being sort of a hero of Knoxville, but I think back around 1850 he really stuck his foot in his mouth and did a lot of damage to our school.
He was a bigot in many ways, who in weird ways redeemed himself later by not passing the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution in Tennessee, and making, no governor has made a bigger effect on the Constitution than Brownlow did. But yeah, that's another story. But
yeah.
But his first book ever published was called Helps to the Study of Presbyterianism, and it's just very tongue-in-cheek. He just is bitterly resentful and sometimes funny. He did not like Presbyterians. Later didn't like Catholics. Later didn't like Confederates. But it was
well, anti-Catholicism though was very common, and we're familiar with it when we think of the mid 1800s. We think of anti-Catholicism, the Know Nothing Party, and whatnot. Yeah. I was really surprised at the level of sectarian fumery between just the regular old evangelical denominations. These days, what are they really not having in common? Casseroles and coffee. But in the as late as the 1850s, they're at each other's throats, often over angels on a pinhead type subjects. I think though what was if we go back to Anderson, now go across the river and go back to see what's going on in Maryville. I think the underlying issue is the issue of slavery heating up. That is sort of the fire under the pot, and there are so many anti-slavery Presbyterians. I think that was probably kind of one of the elements of controversy when it came to sectarianism in the 1840s and 1850s.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We can only speculate, though.
Yeah. There's still a lot to learn. We think that history's nailed down, and there's still a lot out there that we can still study and learn and figure out and connect dots. Anyway, Paul, another picture.
But anyway, Estabrook, he ends up being, I think, probably the most important president of the, at least before the Civil War.
Yeah. All right, here's an old picture of the Hill not too long after the Civil War. And here you see the old college up at the top. I think it's been added on to perhaps since the other picture we had. And some other buildings, including South College, the one that still remains on the left is still there. The only building in that picture that's still there. And this is
So Jack, is it just me, or does the hill look steeper now than it did in those days?
It does.
Or is that an optical illusion?
It may be an optical illusion because it feels steeper, certainly when you're climbing it. I've counted the steps up to the top from the steepest east side several times and never get the same number, but it's like 230 steps from down from Second Creek. But yeah, that you're right. It doesn't look that steep in that picture, that vantage point.
Yeah.
Another picture. And here's from across the river, from over the area that's now probably Scottish Pike, probably area. Looking a little bit later when there are more buildings up there and some Victorian style buildings up the top. It's about 1900. So this is when Tennessee, the University of Tennessee, is really growing. It's surprising that UT was not that not very big. It was a couple hundred students for most of the 19th century until the very late 19th century, and it started to grow and grow some more. But if you read newspapers from the 19th century, you might be surprised that you might go a month without seeing any mention of UT. It was kind of up on its own hill. It had its own stuff going on. It was important to the students who went there, but most people didn't pay that much attention to it.
And of course, this was during the Dabney era, and he's the next, really super important transformative president who comes in the 1880s. Well, I shouldn't skip over Thomas Humes too much. I could talk the entire time about him, but Dabney is really a huge factor in the development of the school.
You're right. Yeah, Thomas Humes was he was an Episcopal priest and kind of he was a real liberal arts guy, wasn't he? And just believed in having studying basically the liberal arts. But they became a land grant college during this time, and they had certain expectations to provide agricultural, industrial, and military training. So I think people finally figured that Humes was not the guy to deliver that.
This is something I could go into a lot more detail about, but the controversy over Humes as being so conservative about liberal arts became conflated with his being a unionist at a time when pro-Confederate feeling was very much in the school and in the town
because
in
it was
the 1870s and 1880s.
Because of statewide politics, right?
Yeah. Belated Confederatism, shall we say.
Yeah.
But Humes had a lot to do with the land grant school ending up in East Tennessee rather than other parts of the state. That's a whole Reconstruction fable right there. But then Dabney is considered a happy choice for a lot of the neo-Confederates because he's the son of one of Stonewall Jackson's chiefs of staff, Robert Dabney. So he sort of melds this new important emphasis on science and engineering with a sense of kind of neo-Confederate, nationalism, shall we say. Yeah.
He's the only president I know of who moonlighted, had another job while he was president. He was Undersecretary
of Agriculture.
U.S. He had an office in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
We had a quick question. In this photo that's up right now, can you see Esther Hall? Is that up there?
That's a good question.
It's very tiny.
Is that it over on the left?
On the left, on the bottom? I can't swear that it's not, but I'm not sure about that.
Because Estabrook is down the slope, and that would be near where Neyland ended up.
Yeah. It was built in 1898, and this is circa 1900, and I assume if it's 1897, it wouldn't be there. If it is a 1900 shot, it should be in the picture.
And Estabrook Hall, allegedly, when they raised it a few years ago, you often heard that it was never meant to be permanent. It actually lasted longer than a lot of people expected it to.
Yeah. But it was kind of sad. It was the only one of only two 19th century buildings still left on campus when they tore it down, and I'm glad we still have one.
Yeah.
South
I'm,
College.
I'm lucky I even got to teach one class there. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. It was yeah. Anyway, yeah. Back to I want to mention just something briefly about Humes, though. Humes being a unionist, I think. Do you think he played a role in getting UT this land grant status, which has made it kind of turbocharged it in some ways more than any other college in Tennessee at the time?
Yeah.
Because it was the Morrill Act passed during the Civil War originally only benefited union not non-secession states, northern
Yeah.
states. And I think UT was it the first college in the South to get this land grant status in 1869.
I believe, yeah, it was definitely the first among former Confederate states. It might have been the first in the South, except maybe for Delaware or Maryland.
Yeah.
But yeah, Humes, Andrew Johnson, and Brownlow kind of put their heads together to make sure that their end of the state was going to get some sort of reward for being the loyal part of Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know as well as I do that, I mean, that's sort of a half truth. East Tennessee was mostly anti-Confederate. It wasn't entirely anti-Confederate, but it was very important to them that as unionists, as loyal unionists, their part of the state was going to get the spoils of victory, and those rebels out in Nashville and Memphis, nothing doing. The problem is, though, it ended up by even as early as the 1880s, when you have this, you know, very cheap, really free education available to poor farmers' kids, you get these very sad letters coming into Dr. Humes and others saying, you know, sir, I would love to come and learn the finer arts of farming from your school, but I'm so poor out here in Obion County, I just need train fare. So what am I going to do?
Yeah.
So it ends up being kind of a sort of ironic play of morality when it comes to the last days of Reconstruction and what happens immediately after that. But it's one of these side effects of Reconstruction in Tennessee, and it's just a fascinating story. I'll present on that specifically next time.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. But it's safe to say, though, if not for this land grant status in 1869, this probably wouldn't have become the University of Tennessee, which it
schools were disappearing left and right in the 1800s. There's so many schools that existed and then no longer exist. Solon's Academy in Bristol, for instance.
Solon's Academy.
It's no longer a school. And there's plenty of others that, including one of the first schools to allow women in the South, which is down kind of west of Chattanooga. It's not a school anymore. So East Tennessee University could have very easily taken that track, especially in that dead area between when Knoxville was still trying to play catch up to cities like Nashville and Memphis. It would have made much more sense for many people for the land grant school to be in Nashville. But, well, Nashville shouldn't have played in on that whole secession scheme, should they? So why reward them?
Yeah. So East Tennessee University becomes the University of Tennessee in 1879, about 10 years after it gets the land grant status. So, and Humes was still there then, but retired. And actually, he was an old man at the time, but became a public librarian downtown. Interesting. He had a fourth career after having been a journalist, an Episcopal priest, a university administrator, and then a librarian. An amazing guy.
And both he and Oliver P. Temple, who was on the Board of Trustees during that time, both of them wrote books touting the patriotism of the loyal Tennessee mountaineer during the war.
Yeah. And Humes is worth reading, definitely. And so was Temple's, but he was a good writer.
Yeah.
But all right, next picture. All right, here's Barbara Blunt Hall, named for one of the early female students. Was this a dormitory for women?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. Dabney was president when women came back. I mean, after those first five, we didn't have women at UT until
1893, I believe.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. The board made the decision in 92, and then they were enrolled and matriculated in 93.
Yeah. Pretty old building. I'm sorry it's not there anymore. Next picture. All right, here's
Same
another
building.
thing, yeah, covered with ivy. We're vying for the Ivy League at this point, I guess. And here's an old science hall. I often see this in the background. It's I can't remember when it was torn down or burned down. Mid 20th century, I think.
I believe it burned in the 30s.
Okay, yeah.
I think it burned in 32 or 35, and there was a huge botanical collection that was lost.
Oh.
And I forget the name of the botanist, but he just lost a tremendous fortune, and a fortune of knowledge, that is, and when it came to botanical collections from the Smokies.
Yeah.
I think that was Science Hall.
That was Harry Jennison.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. All right, next one. All right, here's Estabrook Hall, named for President Estabrook. And this, we were puzzling about this earlier because we remember Estabrook Hall, but I don't, that back part must have been torn down, I'm thinking, when they built Neyland Stadium. But anyway, this was torn down just about 2 years ago. This was an 1898 building, and I was hoping they'd save it, and was thinking about, famous things that had happened there. Besides the fact that Bob Hutton once taught there, was the fact that Buckminster Fuller taught there too. The famous I think the most famous architect who ever visited Knoxville. Taught there in the 1960s, right before they unveiled his big, with the World's Fair at Montreal thing. He was amazingly, he was here just a few days before that. But several famous, they had the architecture school was there, and they had some well-known architects who taught there.
And the entirety of pi to like the 200th digit was printed around one of the ceilings of one of the classrooms.
Entirety of what?
3.14, so on and so forth. Pi.
I'm sorry, I missed that. I never saw that.
That was the classroom I taught in. We called it the pi room.
Well, great.
A tremendous loss when they tore that down, just for that.
Yeah. All right. Well, would love to chat with everybody. If everybody has any Alumni Hall changed not just UT but Knoxville, because when they built it in 1932 or so, suddenly all the stuff that they used to be, Knoxville was about to build a big civic. They were in fact complaining why they didn't build a big civic auditorium, and Alumni Hall kind of took the place of a civic auditorium for Knoxville. So for a long time, all the classical music, big band jazz. Frank Sinatra was there. All these big shows that might have been on Gay Street or somewhere before that were suddenly at UT, and Knoxvillians started going to UT campus for the first time for anything other than a football game, because Knoxvillians ignored UT for a long time until Alumni Hall opened, and now it was this wonderful place where you might see Frank Sinatra or Bob Hope or Doris Day or all these people who performed there.
And it's also beautiful architecture too.
It is.
It's one of our most fetching buildings.
Yeah. Charles Barber did that with.
And it was where UT basketball was located before Stokely Center.
That's right. You're right about that, and that's where the Lady Vols were born as well. I think they ought to have a plaque just for that. But also where Sergei Rachmaninoff gave the last performance of his entire career in 1943, and that's why there's a statue of him over at World's Fair Park.
World's Fair Park.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack, a question that popped up earlier was, let's see, he asked, was the early Blount College curriculum following the trivium format?
That's a good question, and I think you're trying to figure out whether I know what the trivium format was.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer that either. The basic idea was, I think trivium was, I'm probably using this way too loosely, but the basic sense was the recreation of classical education.
Yeah, the three.
Or is it more specific than that?
Three clusters of studies, and I can't remember exactly what they were. But basically, I think whether they did that deliberately or not, I think that would have been at home in Carrick's Blount College.
I think one thing to consider during the Carrick era is how few books would have been available. And whatever model they were trying to imitate, they didn't have the bookstore, and they didn't have Amazon.com, and you pretty much you were going to study what books were available. And
They did, though. I mean, the dry goods stores, I think, did advertise like Byron and people, you know, but they would get books in, and if you didn't buy them this year, you lost your chance. But
yeah,
there were books coming through town and being.
there were, but Byron, that was a little bit later though.
Yeah, a little bit later. Yeah.
I'm thinking like 1794. Just imagine how few books would have actually been in town by our standards.
Yeah. But we had printing. We're printing some law books here certainly, and that was so. That's a good question. We were actually printing novels here by the 1830s, but that was later, of course. But yeah, I'd be interested to know just to go back and see all the advertisements and see what all the books that you can see. I know Robert Burns, for example, was very popular in the 1790s. And, there were some books around. Here
And there was Lawson McGee Library.
Not quite that early, but yeah. Yeah, there actually was a library of effort in 1815, 16, I think. So shortly after Carrick's time, there was an effort to found a public library that lasted for a few years.
But it didn't happen until after 1820, though, did it?
Well, there was it was like a private subscription library that actually had some kind of entity, 1816 to 1821, something like that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was 1817 because Colonel Ramsey's widow, the Black Widow buried it at First Pres. She was the only woman on the board in 1817.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the year that her husband died.
Yeah. And she was also the entrepreneur of a hotel on Gay Street.
Yeah, her husband, Thomas Humes, had died.
Yeah.
Father of the Thomas Humes who became president.
Yeah, she was the stepmother, I guess, or was she a mother? I can't remember whether she was a mother or stepmother of Thomas Humes.
She was his actual mother.
Actual mother, okay, yeah. Yeah, and his father was an Irish immigrant.
From Yahweh.
Yeah.
Bob, I have a question about.
Hey, Ernie.
Hey, Bob. I have a question about the idea that the University of Tennessee goes back to 1794. You know, you're describing very, very different kinds of institutions.
Yeah.
Really going back to, what you're describing in these early years. At what point did the university become self-conscious enough to want to claim that this is a continuous? Has it always, the one institution to the next? Have they always felt like, oh yeah, we started back in 1794, or was there a particular point? Maybe very recently when the university decided it wanted to be as close to as old as Harvard as possible.
I shared your skepticism until I found out about the women students starting the literary society in honor of Barbara Blunt in the 1890s, and they at least this would of course been the decade when you wanted to have a centennial, the 1890s, and they at least, and probably Dabney himself, probably wanted to work up the 1794 date, as specious as it may seem, of course. They wanted to work that up as an origin point, and considering that it does become East Tennessee College within Carrick's lifetime, even though it's right before his death, I think the lineage is there. It's not a complete fib. But it's a bit of a, you're stretching the rubber band just a little bit. But I do think that the women who became students here in the 1890s, they certainly considered Barbara Blunt to be one of their forebears, right, as a student there. And so for that reason, I would say that the myth making probably goes back to the 1890s, if not earlier. And the 1890s, that's a good decade for myth making, right? You want to preserve something of the old because everything's changing.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I'd like to. I want to keep an eye out for that now. I hadn't thought about that. I wouldn't be surprised if Thomas Humes, who had a really strong sense of history himself, if he was thought of the institution that he was president of as having started in 1794.
Well, James Ramsey certainly did. He was a member of the Board of Trustees for years and years, and he certainly considered Carrick to be the founder of his, what he considered his school.
Yeah.
So I think it's members of the Board of Trustees who are playing a role in that too. Probably Oliver Temple, James Ramsey, all of the, I'm drawing a blank on the tower, McClung, all the McClung family.
Yeah.
That whole bunch, I mean, it behooves them to try to establish something as far back as possible that it's a form of boosterism, right?
Yeah.
You want to be able to show that you had origins in the thorny wilderness, and Transylvania College up there in Lexington, they beat us by just that much, right? But you still want to stretch that rubber band as forward back in time as possible to sort of make some sort of point. And of course, the irony is that unlike so many other schools in the old Southwest, we can't stand to leave a building standing more than 50 or 60 years. So it's very difficult for us to really buy into that myth making. But I think at the end of the 19th century, they really wanted to have a centennial to hang their hat on.
Yeah, we need to plant more ivy. Don't you think?
We have kudzu.
Yeah, that'll do, I guess.
We're the kudzu league.
That's instant history, I guess. Kudzu. Yeah.
Especially on my side of the river, we are being overtaken by kudzu. I realized why Joe Wheeler wasn't able to make it up to Fort Dickerson. The kudzu got in his way.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. I really appreciate you being here.